Hey guys, it's the Spirit Room 152. Long time no upload or post or live stream. So lately I've been talking to my buddy Nicole about stories from when my dad worked at this really swanky hotel. So once upon a time in the 1970s, my dad worked at the Hotel Washington in Washington, D.C. He was in his 20s at the time. And the Hotel Washington, it's this historic hotel. It was shut down and renovated and is now known as the W. Washington, D.C. Um, I don't remember, going to the Hotel Washington when it was the Hotel Washington, but I have been there, after it was renovated and turned into the W. Washington, D.C. Now, a little fun fact about the building, it's actually listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It's at the intersection of 15th and Penn. It's the closest hotel to the White House. It's right across this. The hotel is right across the street from the United States Treasury. Um, and when you look at the outside of the hotel, it's even though it says W Washington D.C., it still keeps the signage for the Hotel Washington, which I think is great because it's great to know that they're keeping that piece of history. And the Hotel Washington was a really integral part of my dad's life when he lived in DC in the 70s. So I decided to do a series on my dad's stories from when he worked there, and I'm calling it Nights at the Hotel Washington. And the reason why I chose that is because my dad, he worked as a night auditor. So basically what he did as a night auditor, so he was tasked with checking people in and out. He was tasked with, you know, just writing out, different hotel bills and this, that, and the other. So a little fun fact. So part of the so one of the job requirements is that you're skilled in bookkeeping. Well, when my dad was in high school, he took bookkeeping as a subject and he did not exactly do the best at it. And but for some reason he was able to do it when he worked at a really expensive hotel. Now the Hotel Washington at that time, it wasn't like the most expensive hotel, but it was one of the more upscale hotels. And you know just and I'm going to be telling stories, and a lot of these stories are about people who have stayed in that hotel. um and the people my dad has gotten to meet. And honestly, so I actually, some of the people he's met, I actually envy him on some of them. Yeah, yeah, I genuinely envy him. Um, so, so yeah, and being a night auditor, he worked the graveyard shift. He worked from 11 p.m. at night till 7 in the morning. And I don't imagine it was very, very busy during that time, but I'm not entirely sure. Um, I'm not sure, but um, my dad, he has some pretty fun stories. And so yeah, so like I said, my dad, he met a lot of famous people. He's met actors, actresses, singers, um, politicians. I mean, it's Washington D.C. There were politicians who would go into that hotel. And the two biggest examples I can think of are Henry Kissinger and Senator Ted Kennedy. So Ted Kennedy, he was a member of you know the Kennedy family. They're pretty much seen as United States royalty. And Henry Kissinger, I'm not exactly sure on his job title, so I'm looking that up. So Henry Kissinger, he was at the time the United States Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor under the Nixon and Ford administrations. And my dad had the opportunity, to get to know Mr. Kissinger, and it wasn't until after Mr. Kissinger had served his time as the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor under the Nixon and Ford administrations that this all began. And my dad, being a kid in his 20s and getting to meet these people, it seemed really cool. And so Henry Kissinger and Ted Kennedy, they would often eat at one of the restaurants in the hotel. And so apparently Henry Kissinger and Ted Kennedy were good friends, but according to my dad, with his observations and his interactions, they are complete and total opposites. So, whenever they would run to my dad, Mr. Kissinger, he would be all, he'd be like, "Oh, hey, how are you doing?" And, just kind of, having that moment, just spending a few minutes with my dad, while Ted Kennedy was he wanted nothing to do with my dad, because according to my dad, Ted Kennedy he was a condescending person. And if for some reason any of the Kennedy family sees this, I'm sorry, but I'm just stating, this was my dad's experience, with, your relative. That was just his experience. All right. So don't shoot me. Don't shoot my dad. He was just, that was just his experience. And, it wasn't just at the hotel. My dad would run into Mr. Kissinger and Senator Kennedy, on the streets of DC. At least that's what I remember my dad telling me. And I'm telling these stories because, I really think these are stories people would be interested in hearing. And so, that's just, because that's a huge that was an integral part of my dad's life. And he's turning 72 this week. So he's turning 72 on July 19th. And it's actually kind of interesting because in the 1970s, he was in his 20s. And in the 2020s, he's in his 70s. I think that's pretty interesting. It's just, that's just where my dad's story is. And so back to the Kissinger Kennedy story. So like I was saying, according to my dad, Ted Kennedy was a condescending person. There's only one time on record where Ted Kennedy said something to my dad where he actually spoke to my dad. And when he did speak to my dad, it was because he needed to use the phone in the hotel. Now, mind you, this was the 70s. We didn't have smartphones. They didn't have smartphones. They didn't have any of that. And I imagine if Ted Kennedy had a smartphone back then, if smartphones existed in the 70s, he probably would have been on his the whole time. That's just my guesstimate. So the one time Ted Kennedy talked to my dad, he asked to use the hotel's phone. And, my dad, he went over the steps of how to use the hotel's phone, okay, what number to press, it's like the building's exit code, and kind of like a country exit code when you make an international call, that kind of thing. And my dad instructed him that, it can only be a local call. And so, after that, Ted Kennedy thanked my dad. And then after that, he never spoke to my father again. He never talked to my dad again. I just noticed one hand is darker than the other. Yeah, I do a lot of driving. That's another thing. That's another thing for another time. So that's one of the stories from when my dad worked at the Hotel Washington. And I'm just going to give like some brief description. So the Ted Kennedy story, the Ted Kennedy, Henry Kissinger story, that's just it right there. I'm actually going to be breaking this up into individual videos. So another celebrity encounter, my dad had. Now, see, when my dad worked at the hotel, there wasn't exactly a procedure or like some type of policy in terms of how to act when a celebrity was staying at the hotel. Like whether it be like politician, singer, actress, actor, what have you. All right. Whatever it is, there wasn't exactly like any policies, like a list of specifics that my dad had, at least from what he's told me, it didn't seem like there was. But my dad did have to factor in, some level of professionalism. And so whenever celebrities would stay at the Hotel Washington, they would either check in themselves, like they would go to the desk and do the check-ins themselves, or they would have somebody do it on their behalf. So an example of somebody, checking themselves in. So Shirley MacLaine, to be honest with you, I'm only familiar with her because she was in Bewitched, the 2005 film adaptation, and Steel Magnolias. So when my dad worked at the hotel, so Shirley MacLaine stayed there. And so, she stayed there, but, when she came in, she checked herself in. And according to my dad, she was very bubbly, very engaging, and my dad was able to get an autograph. So that's one thing with his job. He was able to get a lot of autographs, somebody who's had somebody else check in on their behalf. There's two examples. Hank Aaron, I believe he was an MLB player, and like he was like some huge deal. Don't shoot me. This was the 70s. This was like way before I was born. All right. So Hank Aaron, had somebody check him in, and my dad still got an autograph. And the second one, this is actually my favorite story. So Elvis stayed at the hotel, and I remember when I went to the W Washington DC, and I went in, and so I went into the Hotel Washington, after, I'm just gonna call it the Hotel Washington because that's just how I know it. All right. So W Washington DC, Hotel Washington, same thing, but depends on if it's before or after 2006. But screw it. So Elvis stayed at the hotel, and he had somebody check in on his behalf. But here's where it gets interesting. Elvis's security guards literally walked around the building with stacks upon stacks upon stacks upon stacks upon stacks of $100 bills, and they just gave them to every single employee they could get a hold of. And the reason why they why they were handing out all that money was because they wanted some assurances that, you know, Elvis's privacy would be, guaranteed. Like, hey, here's some money in exchange. All right, we're going to give you some money, but it's in exchange for your silence, over Elvis staying in this hotel. So we're literally paying you X amount of money to keep quiet about Elvis's stay. And my dad actually, mind you, I believe this was like 1975, 76, somewhere in there. I do know it was before obviously it was before Elvis passed in 77, but that's another story. So after, Elvis was checked in, my father was paid by Elvis's security guards $200 in exchange for his silence. And so in the 1970s, when my dad worked at the hotel, he made $7 an hour. All right. His weekly wages before taxes was $280. Multiply that by 52. That would be roughly about, $15,000 adjusted for inflation. That's almost $70,000 that my dad got paid to work in a hotel. And so you adjust it for inflation, $200 in the 1970s and $2021, that's about $1,000. So I don't know how many employees, the Hotel Washington had at that time, but either way, inflation or not, it's pretty much the same. Elvis's security guards paid thousands of dollars. Like probably way more than that. They probably paid like tens of thousands of dollars, in exchange for the silence of people in the hotel. And it's kind of interesting because, $200, that was my dad's rent. And he lived in DC. 15 grand a year in 1975, that got you a lot. That bought a lot of things. And he was able to, sustain off that. So, yeah. And then another time when my dad was working there, I believe this was his early days of working there because, so like I said, I believe he started working there in 1973. So The Godfather Part 2 filmed in that hotel. And, so like I was saying, so The Godfather Part 2 filmed at that hotel. And a little fun fact, my dad ended up in the movie. But his scene hit the cutting room floor. So I asked my dad, what his experience with making the movie was like. And he told me that I was like, oh, did the director give you like a specific direction to follow? And he said, no, the director didn't give me a specific direction, but I was given a jacket to wear. Because apparently, so The Godfather Part 2 takes place in 1958. And they needed to, and so in order to make it look like 1958, they had to, change the wardrobe around. So my dad got a special jacket to wear. I don't think he got to keep it though, but his buddy Ray, who was a bellhop in the hotel, he ended up in the final cut of the movie. Another movie that I'm familiar with that was filmed there was Wonder Woman 1984. So a little fun fact about that one. So I remember my first time going to the W Washington DC, after the Hotel Washington had been renovated and renamed. But like I said, they keep the Hotel Washington insignia, on the front of the building. And I really hope they keep it there. So I met the guy who, so I met the night auditor at the time. I don't know if he's still there. His name was Charles. However, one thing I've learned at the W Washington, D.C., the night auditors are now referred to as Moonlight Welcome Desk agents. Graveyard shift is known as the Moonlight shift, and night staff are known as Moonlight staff. And for some reason, bathrooms are known as water closets. I don't know why. I know that the term water closet is prevalent in Europe. I could be wrong, but I do know that I had heard it in the Diary of Anne Frank. So I remember this guy Charles. He was I came in because I needed to use the restroom, and so that's an interesting story. So I came in, I went to the front desk, and I asked you where the restroom was, and then I casually mentioned, "Oh, my dad used to work in this hotel when it was the Hotel Washington, from 1973 until 1980." And I shared with him some stories, the stories I'm sharing with you guys, from the time my dad worked there. And so the current night auditor was telling me about how how his experiences with working at the hotel, at the W Washington DC, they're not far off from when my dad worked there. So apparently, like my father, Charles has checked in celebrities, and he's had to deal with a movie shoot. So I remember. So he told me about how Wonder Woman 1984 filmed filmed on the hotel's rooftop, and he was telling me about how Rachel Ray stayed in the hotel, and so the story goes she checked herself in and she was really nice. So another story from when my dad worked there, Dustin Hoffman, whom I'm familiar with, from Meet the Fockers. I think that's, I've also seen him in Rain Man. Yeah, truth be told, I was not a fan of Rain Man. I'm a person with autism, and usually a lot of shows involving autism just make my brain just numb. So, no disrespect, but Rain Man, from the view of an autistic person, it just turned my brain to soup. But that's another thing. So Dustin Hoffman and another guy, Cleavon Little, who was in a movie called Blazing Saddles, they were staying in the hotel for a few weeks, and because Dustin Hoffman was producing a play down the street. And so the story goes, they were staying at the hotel, and my dad got to hang out with them. Yeah, truth be told, the stories that my dad shares with me, I seriously envy him. And those are the stories I could think of off the top of my head. There's one other story. So one time, Tammy Wynette, may she rest in peace, she stayed at the hotel. And one night, one morning after my dad was, finishing up his shift and clocked out. So he typically clocked out at 7 a.m. He saw Tammy Wynette sitting all by herself in in one of the hotel's restaurants, and it was in the lobby. My dad, he went up to her, and he was like, "Oh, hi, Miss Wynette, how are you doing?" And then she said, talked about how she felt lonely because, life on the road, just felt really lonely. And I've actually read, different accounts, like, of celebrities feeling lonely on the road. And I mean, like, when they're, touring and all that. I mean, so just that kind of thing. And then And, my dad asked her if, she could join him for breakfast. And, he got to do that and they got to talk. And, it was a great time. And so almost 2 years ago, so I work at a convenience store called Royal Farms. All right. So here's a fun little story. So one day when I was working there, I actually got to have a little bit of an understanding of what it was like for my dad when he was dealing with famous people on his job. This only happened to me once while I was this only happened to me once on my current job, but it was that I'm currently on leave on for medical reasons. But it was really epic. And so there was a show I really liked called Star. And and at the time when this happened, Star had been canceled. So I remember this particular day. It was Black Friday 2019. I remember being very, very salty, because not only was I scheduled to work, but my boss wanted me to come in early. And I remember I was feeling pretty salty. So my shift starts at 1, I'm counting in my register and I'm just not having it. But then, so over a span of a few minutes, I remember I saw somebody walking through the store. I was like, wait, she looks familiar. And I remember this girl, she had a black leather jacket, a cropped gray hoodie, and she had these big hoop earrings, light brown curly hair. And I was like, she looks so familiar. And then another few minutes pass, and I see her at the, and so the Royal Farms I work at, we have 2 registers that are manned by employees, and then we have 3 self-checkouts. And so a few minutes later, I see this girl at the middle self-checkout. And she looks like Jude Demarest from Star. And so I looked over at her and I said, you look like that girl from Star. Her name is Jude Demarest. And she was like, that's me. I was like, what? And mind you, my boss was standing there the whole time while this was happening. And quite frankly, this is how it went down. I was like, wait, oh my God, really? She's like, yeah. I was like, oh my God, hi, can I get a picture with you? And she's like, yeah, sure. So I sprinted from my register around this bend to the middle self-checkout. I took a selfie with her. And I was like, so what brings you here to Edgewood, Maryland, of all places? I was like, so what brings you here to Edgewood? And she was like, oh, my husband's from here and we're visiting his family. And yeah, that was a pretty big deal for me. And truth be told, I was actually, so like I was saying, so my boss was standing right there the whole time. And quite frankly, I was expecting him to be like, Christina, now's not the time. Or it's that, all right, this isn't the time for that. I was fully expecting my boss to do that. But, instead he was understanding. And, he was really cool about it. He was super cool about it. And he just let me have my moment. And so, yeah, I think that's about it for all my stories. So, all right. See you guys.